29 days, political leaders in Jammu and Kashmir, several senior leaders, several not so senior, have been taken into custody. They've been detained, and the voices of several political parties have been suppressed in Jammu and Kashmir. The government says it's hoping for some more time before political leaders are released, but for the families of those who are detained, there are lots of question marks on just what is happening in the state. Perhaps the biggest concern is the lack of information, not just on political leaders, but on the overall condition of the state, and reports on the ground on what exactly is happening in Jammu and Kashmir extremely sketchy. The government says it's got the situation under control, but international media reports suggest that that is not the case. One of the leaders who was in fact detained for several days was the Srinagar mayor, Junaid Mattu. He joins us now. He's actually been in Delhi because he's been unwell and has undergone a couple of procedures at hospital, but he's on his way back to Srinagar because he believes that that's where he needs to be, and he realizes that returning to Srinagar might result in him being detained again. Thanks very much for speaking to us. You're going back to a scenario where you could be detained. You're ready for that?
Yes, I mean, as bad as the situation is, you have to be there, be doing politics and leading the people in good times, gives rise to this moral obligation to be there even in these tough times. I was detained on the 5th. I was allowed to come here on the 13th, and I've undergone 2 invasive medical procedures here. But I'm, on the mend. I have, recovered, and I think till my next scheduled appointment, I should go back and be there.
What about the signs that we are getting on the ground? Several political leaders are in the last couple of days, in fact the last week, being allowed to see their loved ones, their family members. Do you believe this is a precursor to political leaders being taken out of detention?
Well, it's hard to say. The fact that family members have been allowed to meet the leaders is, from what one understands, is because the jail manual has come into force, and the detention centers have been converted into subsidiary and sub jails. So there is actually no legal way to stop family members from meeting them. It's all speculative at this moment. One doesn't see a way forward. What is the next step? The operational containment of the immediate repercussions. That's what the administration has been talking about and focusing on. But what next? What follows this? And almost the entire mainstream leadership is under detention.
Right. Just in terms of what the government has been saying, I'd like to get your reactions. They've been saying, and this is quotes from the DC of Srinagar, Shahid Chaudhary. He's been saying, "In my official, personal, moral capacity, I want to assure everyone that there is no healthcare crisis. Some difficulties unique to the post-August 5th situation exist." But he says that the reports coming out from several places, he says, are not accurate. He says they're grossly exaggerated. In speaking to people over there and in having been over there for a while before coming over here, what's the ground situation?
Well, unfortunately, the administrative narrative and that of the police has focused on purely operational mechanisms. The absence of dead bodies and blood on the street doesn't mean the situation is normal and people are happy. Talking about the medical situation, it's not just about stockpiling medicines. The very fact that there are no, the mobile phones aren't working, there is a lack of mobile telecommunication, internet isn't working. People need dialysis, people need chemotherapy. I'm suffering a chronic ailment, and there are days when I need to reach out to a doctor for an emergency, probably in the middle of the night. There are pregnant women, and there was a news story about a pregnant woman losing her child. Then there was a doctor, apparently a merit holder, who sat in the press enclave saying that my patients can't reach me for dialysis, and if they don't, it's a fatal. There are fatal repercussions, and he was whisked away. So it is highly unrealistic for anybody to say that the situation is normal. Containing a sentiment or the aftermath of a decision by enforcing a clampdown doesn't amount to the situation being normal. Now we've seen visual shots, and since I've been
here. Just give me one moment and we'll talk about what you're saying. Just because he's come out with another tweet on surgeries. He says, here are post August 5th surgeries: LD Hospital 1168, SMHS 682, Bone and Joint Hospital 800. He says, and he goes on with other numbers. He says it's absolutely in consonance with our monthly average this year, basically making the point that there is no health crisis on the ground.
Well, health crisis is a broad term. You know, I'm sure people who have elective surgeries can't reach them.
Correct.
People in emergency cases, you know, I'm sure Shahid and officers like them are doing the best they can in the given situation. This decision wasn't of their choosing, but I'm sure they're doing the best they can. But to suggest that this is not evolving into a humanitarian crisis, what are the makings of a humanitarian crisis? Families not able to, you know, communicate with each other, parents not able to communicate with their children studying outside, you know, people, children not able to communicate with their sick elderly parents. And then obviously the fact that, as I was trying to say, that, you know, we are seeing these visuals on social media put out by officers about traffic on the roads.
Yes.
So is the fact that people are going out to buy food and essentials, does that amount to normalcy? Right. You know, the very act of buying groceries or going out to buy medicines, does that amount to normalcy? And the very fact that the entire, not just the mainstream leadership, elected representatives, you know, my deputy mayor, he's an elected representative in a ULB election which the government says is an achievement. Right. He's under detention. Right. Mainstream activists, and this is the most shocking and surprising part, you have covered Kashmir, the mainstream activists and the mainstream constituency in Kashmir has over the years braved threats and violence by violent elements and militants and survived in the mainstream, invested their faith and their lives in the mainstream. Today they are being hunted, hounded, detained. Their families are being harassed. So go back a couple of years, you know, you have mainstream activists who face some sort of a social discomfort and a risk to their lives to be in the mainstream. And today the same mainstream is passing preventive detention orders against them.
But in terms of violence itself, again over here there have been differing accounts. The government, for example, insists that there has been no gunfire. There was a video which we could hear gunfire. But I'm led to believe if that was gunfire, it was shots fired in the air. It wasn't, you know, targeting people. On the other hand, there are international reports which suggest that there have been massive protests and massive stone pelting. So what is the truth of the on-ground situation?
Well, I don't have the specifics, so I can neither contest them or validate them. While in Srinagar, I was completely severed off and under detention. But it is safe to assume that the situation is not normal. You know, the anger and anguish, the sense of humiliation, not just, you know, at the abrogation of 370, which is the disavowal of constitutional guarantees offered to the state, but also the downgrade of the state and, you know, carving out 2 union territories out of it without any consultation or assent from the representational body of the state. The sense of insult and humiliation is pent up. There's this dam. You know, I don't know what and how they expect to dissipate that. It's not possible to dissipate that. But as I said, their policy and outlook seems to be purely operational, one of containment and operational police mechanisms. Yeah. So the situation isn't normal. About incidents, specific incidents, I wouldn't have the information to validate or contest them.
So the other standpoint over here is that yes, communications lines were down, but it's better than it was. Jammu has, the phone lines have been restored. Broadband hasn't been restored in most areas, but that it's happening slowly, but it is happening. So to say that people are still not in touch with their families is perhaps an exaggeration. It's certainly difficult, but there seems to, according to the government, been an improvement. Is that true?
Well, improvement to the degree that certain exchanges are working, but exchanges in some areas, I can speak for Srinagar, are not working. Right. Like the inner city, Nauhata and everywhere. So there are still a lot of families which haven't been able to communicate with their near and dear ones. While I was here, I got a message from somebody in Delhi about a student from Delhi, not a Kashmiri, who had gone for an exchange program to a university in Baramulla in North Kashmir, and they weren't able to trace her for the last 10 days. And their sense of, you know, shock and dismay is something that you can see in countless families in Kashmir, because there are young students they can't get in touch with. So as I said, whatever the district administration is doing under the given circumstances, I have no reason to contest that, but it in no way gives a semblance of normalcy.
So just going forward, sooner than later, the situation, one would hope, becomes normal. What role would mainstream political parties in Jammu and Kashmir have? Because there is one line of thought that both the NC and the PDP have been greatly discredited. For them to get the support of people on the ground would be challenging at the best of times. In a scenario like this, how do you see the political path ahead?
Well, it's very hard to see a way forward in the given circumstances for anybody. I think this is an existential issue for the entire mainstream. The identity of the mainstream in Kashmir has pivoted around Article 370 and the special status, There is obviously a political sentiment in Kashmir, and the mainstream has tried to allay those fears and apprehensions by saying that we have an article of the Indian Constitution which protects our unique identity, which protects the bargained terms of accession. Now that's gone. The pivot around which the mainstream existed is gone. So I don't know when the mainstream leadership will be released. Before this decision was taken, there were a couple of all-party meetings.
Yes.
Our party was there, and NC was there, and PDP was there, and Congress was there. And the spirit of the all-party meetings was this, because this issue is much larger than all of us combined and any of us isolated. This is a larger existential issue for the mainstream and for the people. So as and when the mainstream leadership will be released, I think we'll all need to somehow sit and understand this is an existential issue and recalibrate ourselves with an aim to represent the angst and aspirations of the people, not
necessarily as divergent parties. Are you talking about greater cohesion between different political parties?
I mean, it's something of the sort which doesn't hinge on partisan competition.
So what exactly
there is no competition in these terms. Something that will have to be worked out, but as I said, something in the spirit of the all-party meetings. Any kind of, inner competition within the mainstream, because it is an existential question, as I said, for the entire mainstream.
Yeah. One final question. All of this, according to the government, and I think this makes a lot of sense, is linked to security on the ground. There is a threat of terrorist attacks. It's all pervasive over there. In a situation like this, when there is political upheaval, where there is a lack of expression of political dissent, wouldn't it be catastrophic if there were a terrorist attack or a terrorist threat? In a situation like this, realistically, do you expect those boots on the ground to actually move away?
Well, we have always lived with a very palpable threat of violence. It's not a new scenario. But to use that palpable, threat of violence, of attacks, to justify the almost complete and brazen withdrawal of fundamental rights. That is at the core of alienation in Kashmir. And that whole argument, I mean, you're talking about an argument which talks about the larger good, that this is good for you. The medicine is bitter and sour, but it's good for you. It beats the alternative of fatalities. That's what the argument has been, right? But this argument of larger good and we know what's best for you has been abused, not just in this specific scenario. It's been abused throughout history. And even now it's abused in a lot of places around the world to, impose restrictions after decisions are taken which go against the aspirations and popular sentiment of the people.
Sure.
So somewhere down the line, it's a very thin line between saving lives and between enforcing and imposing decisions that the people don't agree with.
All right, well, Junaid, thanks very much for speaking to us. A difficult decision. Perhaps not so difficult, but a fairly resolute Junaid Mattu wanting to go back to Srinagar sooner than later in a scenario where he faces uncertainty. He could be put back into detention over there. But I think it's the call for peace which everybody would hope for at this stage, that there is no violence on the ground. But for me, the big takeaway over here is mention of how political parties need to come together once the situation becomes somewhat better on the ground, to represent perhaps a new, more cohesive political force in Jammu and Kashmir.